So good morning. I don't know, or good evening. Anyway, you keep it. My name is Bernd Wollschlaeger. I had the pleasure to be in Australia several years ago, been in Melbourne too, to speak about my life. And I'm happy to be virtually visiting you again. And unfortunately, the circumstances that they are, I'm sitting here in a golden cage in Florida and cannot leave. But anyway, whenever I'm being asked to talk about my life, I have a real problem to overcome a certain hurdle. I mean, it got better, the threshold and the hurdle, but I have to explain who I am with all the conflicts and the contradictions lying within me. But once my son started a discussion when he was 14 years old, he's now 31, he asked me a very simple question. Dad, who is my grandfather? And when I asked my son asked this question, I asked myself, my God, I never asked him or told him about my life before. Because my life is slightly complicated. Because on the one hand, his father, yours truly, is Jewish, is an Israeli, and has served as a medic in the combat unit of the Israeli army. On the other hand, my son, a nice Jewish boy born and raised in Israel, is Jewish, of course, in Israeli, and is far away from the life that I lived, that I am. And specifically that my father was a highly decorated World War II hero and National Socialist is hard to reconcile with my personal life being Bernd Wollschlaeger, the doctor, the Jew, and the Israeli, as my son always calls me. So my son asked me, who is my grandfather? And this question I had to answer. And what I told him is approximately what I'm going to tell you. I was born May the 9th, 1958, in a gorgeous city in Germany called Bamberg. Rabbi, before I continue, I think I'm on the small screen. Is this okay? Or?
Oh, let me.
I like to look at you, but it's a little bit irritating.
Yeah, sorry. I'm just trying to work out how to make your spotlight your video.
You have a nice put, and I'll look at it for the next couple of minutes.
I will just work out how to spotlight you as well. There we go.
Great. So on the contradiction that I tried to point out to my son, I explained to him, and what I explained to him is what I'm going to explain to you. Born and raised in Germany in 1958 in a gorgeous city called Bamberg. I don't do a German tourism industry quiz, and I'm not going to ask you where it's located, but it's a 1,000-year-old city nestled between Würzburg and Nuremberg in the north of Bavaria, in a pristine, beautiful kind of Cinderella world. This city was untouched by any wars, 1,000 years old, and as children, we learned the importance of history, specifically to appreciate history over the course of 1,000 years. So as children, we knew in elementary school already, we knew what famous queen, princes lived where and when, who belongs to whom, what is the importance of this painting. So we had a very intensive exposure towards history. But one thing I noticed that something is not right. There was an aspect of history that was taboo. It was a kind of a black hole. And that's the time between 1933 and 1945. I knew that a war happened. Even as a little munchkin of 7, 8, 9 years old, I knew a war happened because in the war, people win and people lose. And one thing I noticed that we had 15,000 American soldiers and family members in our city of 75,000, that we obviously didn't win that war. And whenever I asked my parents about that war, I got the same answer. It's over. Everything is by. We're moving forward. Everything is over. We're moving forward. But how could we move forward without knowing about that war? Because the war impacted not only my life, but my parents' life. When I, for example, asked about my grandparents, I was told that my grandparents are gone because of the war, but we're not going to talk about the war. We're moving forward. So this black hole remained a black hole. And slowly but surely, my parents started to tell me, at least at home, about their own lives because I was a nerd. I was asking them at least once a week about my grandparents. I was very curious. I didn't understand why I cannot learn history about my own life. And my father and my mother shared then when I was about between 8 and 10, that was kind of the time when they started, they shared to tell me their personal lives. And their personal lives were very, very different. On the one hand, my father told me about his life in glory in battle, the knight in shining armor, the officer who fought in the war And I have no doubt that this was a story of knight in shining armor, because my father's friends, his old war buddies, came to visit our house at least once a month, to celebrate the good old times. And for the good old times, that meant the war. And they referred to my father as Arturo, his first name was Arthur, our hero, and looked at me and congratulated me to be my father's son, and said, you need to appreciate what your father did. And I heard over and over again what my father did. He was the youngest tank commander in the German army, serving under command of General Guderian, the father of the German Blitzkrieg. And as such, he battled literally as an elite unit. They pushed through the first border crossing in the 1st of September 1939, occupying Poland. My father's tanks were the first to roll in. The next year, the attack on France and Belgium and Netherlands, my father's tanks were the first to roll in. And then the following year, in 1941, in the summer of 1941, the attack on the former Soviet Union, which my father's tanks not only rolled in first, they also conquered a strategically located town on the push towards Moscow called Orel. And for that accomplishment, he was awarded a Knight's Cross by a man whom he still adoringly referred to as his Führer, Adolf Hitler. Now, I had no idea who Adolf Hitler was. I just was mighty proud that my father was awarded a Knight's Cross and that everybody admired him. For a little boy like me, my father was a hero. On the other hand, my mother told me a completely different story. The story of horror, of catastrophe. My mother was born as an ethnic German in Czechoslovakia, a so-called Sudeten German. There were about 1.5 to 2 million ethnic German lived on the border between Czechoslovakia, in the border region between Czechoslovakia and West Germany. And as a result of the war, they were evicted, many were killed. And my mother's home was destroyed. My grandfather's flourishing manufacturing business was destroyed, was a glove manufacturer, and they escaped barely with their lives. Actually, my grandparents did not. They died as refugees. And so I heard on the one hand, the story of glory for my father, on the other hand, the story of horror for my mother's side. But it was something else. This black hole was still a black hole, at least partially. In our house, we lived, my parents rented an apartment from in a huge 2-story, massive patrician-style building, 19th century style, which is still standing in Bamberg. We rented an apartment downstairs from a landlady upstairs. And my mother referred to the landlady that she's a noble woman. And I should not talk to her unless spoken to. So the Countess, I should not speak to her. And in the hallway, right next to the wooden stairway leading upstairs to this massive apartment, huge apartment of the Countess, on the hallway right next to the wooden stairway was a huge portrait mounted on the wall, depicting an officer in uniform, like my father, whose pictures I saw at home, or at least the pictures that he showed me about him. And he was as a uniform, the Knight's Cross around his neck, the officer's cap, proud looking. And when I asked my father who this man was, my father referred to him as the traitor. I was a little bit confused. How can a man who looked like my father is bad in uniform and my father in uniform is a good person? Simple question of a child. Until I found out that this portrait was the picture or the portrait depicting Count Klaus von Stauffenberg, the German colonel who was leading the assassination attempt on Adolf Hitler on the 20th of July, 1944, which unfortunately failed. And he was executed with hundreds of others, and his wife, Nina von Stauffenberg, living upstairs. Now, the widow, Nina von Stauffenberg, lived upstairs. She was thrown in a concentration camp 2 days later, survived, and her children survived too after being transported to Buchenwald. And they rebuilt their lives and maintained his message, freedom. And my father never told me about that. And the only way to find out about him was indirectly to be closer or to speak with the Countess von Stauffenberg. Now, I was 8, 9, 10 years old. Of course, I couldn't articulate any meaningful intellectual discussion about that topic because I still didn't know much about it. But she had children, grandchildren. And on Sunday afternoons when my parents had the Schlafstunde, or they slept for 2 hours in the afternoon, I sneaked upstairs when the grandchildren were there and played with them in this huge apartment, wall to wall, were pictures mounted on the wall of her and this man, her husband, Count Klaus von Stauffenberg, picture of love, attention, family life, empathy. my father couldn't be right that this was a bad man, a traitor. So with that kind of exposure towards history, I entered my 11th or 12th year of life when we started to talk about that war. And what we heard about that war in school was a little bit more the sanitized version. The version that I heard was the following. Adolf Hitler rose to power on January the 30th, 1933, occupied the all access to power with his goons. Soon thereafter, a year later, Germany transformed from a fledgling democracy into a dictatorship. Hitler started the Second World War, or 60 million people died. Among them, 6 million Jews as collateral damage of war. And then on the 8th of May, 1945, Hitler disappeared, like the Huns invading Germany, and everything was over. We started our life again. Well, that was, of course, a story of horse manure. It's a PG-rated event. I don't want to use the term that I have in mind, but this was the sanitized version of history. And then came an event that changed everything in German history, in post-war German history, and this changed the course of my life. The Olympics in Germany, in Munich, 1972. Well, Munich 1972 was an event that we were prepped for as children, as now growing up in West Germany, as an event that should demonstrate to the world that we are now a full democracy, worthwhile to host the Olympics, not like in 1936 when Adolf Hitler abused the Olympics in Berlin for propaganda purposes. No, this is now the new Germany, the Germany of 1972, part of the NATO alliance, part of the growing European Community Alliance. We were a democracy led at that time in 1972 by a chancellor whose name was Willy Brandt, who was a complete break of the past. Until 1969, subsequent generations, so to say, politicians in Germany were tainted by the past. Some of them were former National Socialists, like Kurt Georg Kiesinger from 1966 to 1969. He was not only our chancellor with the past as a National Socialist, he was not only a member of the National Socialist Party, he was a member of, or actually a highly ranking official in the Ministry of Propaganda of the National Socialist Party in Germany. And Willy Brandt, who rose to power in 1969, was a socialist who escaped from Germany in 1933, returned to Germany in 1949, reclaimed his citizenship, and rebuilt the Social Democratic Party, which then rose to power in 1969. And his first act as a foreign messenger, so to say, he was not the foreign minister, but our prime minister, he traveled to Poland in December 1970, and in front of the Ghetto Memorial in Warsaw, he sank on his knees, bowed his head, and remained in prayer, in silent prayer. And this picture of the chancellor kneeling in front of the memorial went around the world. And of course, it was posted on the front page of our local newspaper too. And I remember my father telling me, yelling, "Schau mal her, Bernd, wieder ein Verräter. Look, Bernd, again a traitor." And for me, I was confused. How can a man kneeling in front of a memorial be a traitor? Now, I was raised by my mother as a Orthodox Catholic. My father was a atheist, he said, but he was a Protestant by upbringing. And as an Orthodox Catholic, I went to Catholic elementary school, Catholic kindergarten, elementary school. I was an altar boy. My mother wanted me to become a priest. Well, that didn't work out, obviously. And for me, kneeling in front of a memorial was a sign of devotion. And for my father, this was a sign of treason. What is going on? And so the same chancellor, with this tremendous standing in the Western world, opened the Olympics in Munich on this beautiful August day in 1972 to a great fanfare. And my parents invited friends over. We had our first TV, black and white though. And everybody was coming together in the living room, beer, wine, fine food, and it was a joyous event. And we watched all the teams parading to the stadium, carrying their respective flags. And suddenly a team paraded into the stadium, carrying a flag with a star inside. Now, I had no idea what that meant, but the reaction of my parents and their friends were telling. Everybody felt silent, as if a ghost appeared on the screen. It was the do not ask them the question moment. And I asked myself, well, that's weird. Why everybody reacts like that? This was for me a team like Poland, Switzerland, or whoever carried a flag. I never saw this flag before, but I had neither opinion for or against it. And so 10 days later, the catastrophe occurred. The same team that so proudly paraded into the stadium was brutally attacked by a group of Palestinian terrorists. And 2 Israelis were butchered on the spot. The remainder were taken hostage. And the German government, deeply embarrassed and shocked that Jews were killed on German soil, dispatched the highest-ranking representatives of the German politicians, among them the Minister of Interior, who negotiated face-to-face with the terrorist leader, Issa, begging him, offering him himself as a hostage in return for the Israelis. Issa, the terrorist leader, refused, demanded in the ensuing negotiations that the German government should make available a Boeing 707 of the German army to fly them to an Arab country of their choice, and that Israel should get prepared to exchange hundreds of Arab prisoners in Israeli prisons to be exchanged with the hostages. That never happened. What happened was in that evening, which I still remember, and it was beat by beat played out on live German TV, 2 helicopters took off in the Olympic Village with the hostages and the terrorists in each of them, and flying to the nearby military airport of Fürstenfeldbruck, landing behind the closed gates, and suddenly all hell broke loose. Firefight, explosions, the night sky lit by explosions, and suddenly deafening silence. And then an American journalist turned towards the camera in his exhausted stare and said one sentence: "They're all gone." What happened? The German police opened fire on the terrorists. The Israeli elite Mossad units, Mossad Kidon units specifically, were on the ground, offering the Germans to do it, to rescue the hostages, begging them not to attack because these are elite soldiers, elite units of the Palestinian Liberation Organization. And the German police opened fire. And in the ensuing firefight, several terrorists were killed. The 2 remaining survivors threw a hand grenade in one helicopter, which exploded, and all the Israelis perished in a fireball. The other helicopter they sprayed with machine gun fire, and everybody died. The next day, this picture that went around the world, that changed the course of my life: 2 helicopters on the tarmac, one burned out with the charred remains of the Israelis inside. The other helicopter with the bodies of the Israelis slumped over the seats, and a huge headline above: "Jews killed in Germany again." In German, of course. Now, I speak perfect German. I spoke perfect German then. But I didn't understand the component of again, this word again. What does it mean? And I asked my father what happened. And my father was livid. He's screaming and yelling, "Schau mal her, was wieder die uns antun." Look what they're doing to us again. They destroy again the image of Germany. That's all what they do. They, he meant the Jews. So the victims as perpetrators and the perpetrators as victims. My father was angry that they were murdered on German soil, staining the German honor. And I was confused because the reaction at school was very different. Our teachers, for the first time, I was 14 years old, started to talk about history as they experienced it. The murder of 6 million Jews, not collateral damage of war. For the first time, at the age of 14, I heard Auschwitz, Birkenau, the final solution, the murder of 6 million in the name of Germany and in the name of a people, not of an extreme party of murderers, of everybody. Everybody was stained. And I was shocked. I walked home, I remember that day, thinking about what happened. My father, the war hero, battled on every war front. He must be able to tell me a little bit more about that. And I asked my father, look, in school we started to talk about the Holocaust. What do you know about it? And my father, I remember him unemotionally told me, the Holocaust is a lie, my teachers are communists. It never happened. And in our house, we don't talk about that. So it was caught between the rock and the hard place. On the one hand, my father, who completely denied the Holocaust. On the other hand, my teachers who tried to make us understand what happened. And I decided to find out the truth. I was a curious child, I always was curious. I always asked why. Therefore, some people don't like me very much. But I started to read as much as I could about that time in libraries and bookstores, published in English and German and French. And I read about the horror. I read about the catastrophe, what Germany did. And I decided to ask my father about the truth because something was not right. Something affected my father, or my father was concealing something. And I needed to know the truth, the whole truth from his mouth. And so I wanted to talk to him. My father was a raging alcoholic. And as a child of an alcoholic parent, I knew there are 3 stages during the day that I could talk or not talk to him. Stage 1, when he was looking for a drink, he was restless, irritable, discontent. Stage 3, when he was drunk, I couldn't talk to him. I was in La La Land. But stage 2, I call it nowadays the Schicker zone. He was inebriated, so to say, and his tongue was loose, and I could manipulate him, get money out of him, and ask him questions. And the questions and answers I can group in three phases. Phase 1, I asked him about what happened, and my father responded, look, Bernd, whatever allegedly happened, we didn't do it, we, the military. It was all the SS. Now, that was, of course, a lie, which I already knew that it was a lie, because from the lady upstairs, Nina von Stauffenberg, I heard that her husband, a high-ranking German colonel, working literally in the heart of the beast in Berlin, responsible for the logistical supply of troops in the front, knew that there was a problem because all the train capacity that he tried to figure out to supply the troops was never enough, because there were trains going to a place called Auschwitz, Treblinka, Majdanek. So ranking German officers knew, my father knew. The fact that he knew, I learned actually only 20 years after his death, when I discovered pictures of him, or a picture of him sitting next to Heinrich Himmler in 1942 at a conference in East. Heinrich Himmler, the head of the SS. When the head of the SS sat together with German officers, high-ranking officers, it was not about tank tactics. It was securing territory for mass murder. Well, phase 2, when I asked my father, I can summarize as follows. Well, if there were civilians killed during the war, that is okay, according to the Geneva Convention. They're terrorists, or they're partisans, he said. Nowadays we call them terrorists. And I said, well, you kidding me? 1.2 million children, just because they didn't wear any uniform, were your enemy attacking the German army, the mightiest army in the world? This 1.2 million children were gassed in Auschwitz and in Majdanek and in Birkenau. They were killed. Their bodies were burned, their ashes scattered on the killing fields of Birkenau and Auschwitz. You're telling me they're fighting the mightiest army in the world? This is horse manure. I was angry because he still tried to impress upon me that he said the truth. And then one evening he was drunk and he told me, cold-blooded, look, Bernd, your generation is too weak. The whole world is too weak. The world should give us a medal and a prize and a reward, because we took care of all the dreck, we took care of all the schmutz, we took care of all the lichluch. We took care of them, that they don't destroy the world. They are not humans. They were rats, they were animals. Now, that was the way he referred to the Jews. And that was not my father, whom I looked up to, the knight in shining armor, the hero. This was a common criminal for me. This was the last straw that broke the camel's back of trust. I turned away from my father. I wanted to find out the truth. And I approached one of my teachers, a Jesuit priest, a former Jesuit priest, and said, Bernd, I, as a progressive Catholic, had to come to terms that my church, my people committed horrendous crimes, and I had to make amends. I made amends with Jews, 2 Jews in Israel. And I said, well, how can I do that too? Because I want to make amends. I said, well, you may not be able to travel to Israel, but there's a group of young Israelis, Jews and Arabs alike, that the Catholic Church, at least the progressive wing of the Catholic Church in Germany, invites once a year to learn from each other, to practice peace. And I personally always send a representative of a school, of a German school, and you can be the representative this year. And so for the first time in the age of 19, I met Israeli Jews and Israeli Arabs too. And when young people get together, the last thing you want to try to find out what separates you, what divides us. The first thing we try to find out what unites us, and what music you like, what books you like, what food you like. And I must say, Rabbi, I not only liked the Israelis and the abstract thinking of religion, but I like the Israeli girls a lot. Now, nothing wrong with that. And one of the Israeli girls who liked me too, she said, look, Bernd, if you want to see me again, Tacheles, you have to come to Israel and visit me, and my parents too. And I was a big Schwitzer. I said, of course I'm going to do that, with the tiny little problem. I had no passport and no money. And at that time, traveling to Israel, flying to Israel was financially impossible. It was still a luxury. So over the next 3 months, I scratched some money together from summer jobs and got my German passport in order. And in October 1979, I traveled to Israel in a way that I do not recommend. I hitchhiked to Munich. From Munich, I took a train across the Alps to Ancona, an Adriatic port city in Italy. From there, I took a ferry and slept on deck, not a cruise, to Haifa. We stopped in Piraeus for provisions. And in Piraeus, I sent her a telex. That was before Google, Schmoogle, and all the good stuff that we have nowadays, and announcing that I will come in that and that time, that and that day, will arrive in Israel. And so on this beautiful morning, early in the morning, I remember the ferry approached the port of Haifa. Everybody was praying on top of the deck, had tefillin on. It was a very emotional moment. And when we docked in the harbor, disembarked, and I was suddenly standing on Israeli ground and had this sinking feeling, oh my God, what if somebody would recognize my name, Wollschlaeger, as my father maybe did something to him or her. But all these doubts were wiped away when I met her. And she embraced me, kissed me, and said, look, Bernd, let's go to visit my parents. And we took a community taxi up to Neve Sha'anan in Haifa. That was a township right in the top of the Carmel Mountain, mostly working class people, small apartments, small houses. And her parents were waiting outside. They were enjoyed, they embraced me, they were joyful, as if they knew me for decades. The long lost son. Her father took my rucksack and her mother took my bags, and they guided me into the apartment. And it was a small apartment. They all moved into the living room, making one little room available for me. And they were chit-chatting with me in Yiddish. I had no idea what they were talking about because Yiddish is not German. And my friend translated as much as she could, interpreted. And suddenly her father, sitting at the table, offering me a cup of coffee and some boekas, looked at me and spoke in fluent German. If you want to speak German, Bernd, I still speak German. And I asked him, how do you speak German? In a very naive fashion. And he looked at me, rolled up the sleeve of his forearm, of his shirt in the forearm, and pointed the number tattooed on this left forearm and said, I was in the camps. Ich war in den Lagern. And I was here sitting in the chair, wanting to sink in the ground and disappear. For the first time I was in Israel, for the first time in a home of a Jewish family, and the first time in a home of Holocaust survivors. What should I do? And he looked at me and said, look, Bernd, it's not you. I don't blame you. I was liberated in January 1945, well, sort of. And he stayed in Germany from 1945 to 1948 in displaced person camp. And I had to learn that not all Germans were monsters. But I want to know, do you know about that time? Do they teach you about that time? And I honestly answered him, I don't know. I don't know enough. And he took me to Yad Vashem a few days later and took me by the hand to the exhibit in Yad Vashem, the Holocaust Memorial in Yerushalayim. And I broke down. Emotionally, I broke down. I cried. And he looked at me and said, Bernd, this is not you. This is the history of our people, of your people. You're not a bad person. And here I was standing right next to him, right at the exhibit, and asked myself, how can this man rebuild his personal life, rebuild a family, rebuild an old nation anew? They're unique, these Jews. I want to find more about it. When I returned to Germany, I approached the Jewish community in my hometown, which was very difficult in general to approaching Jewish communities in Germany. At that time, there were about 25,000 Jews left in Germany in a population of 65 million. And I found this small Jewish community in my hometown. And I remember in the first encounter when I knocked at the glass door in the backyard of a building that was not even marked that there was a Jewish community. And an old man opened the door, looking at me and asked me, what do you want? And I must have told him the whole life story in 5 minutes because he felt comfortable to open the door, led me to in his office. It was a hot day. The sun was shining very, very brightly. So he closed the windows, closed the curtains. There was no fan, there was no air condition. It was very hot in this room. And he was this small man, introducing himself as Yitzhak Rosenberg, the chair of the Jewish community, had his short white sleeved shirt on and the number tattooed on his forearm. And I stared at the number. I said, look, this is Auschwitz. My name is Yitzhak Rosenberg. I was in Auschwitz. I was liberated. I lost all my family. So, but that's the past. What do you want? And I told him my story. I said, well, it's a sad story. Do you want to take a book and read about us? I said, I read all the books that were published. And so what do you want? He said, I want to learn. I want to help. I said, learn for me? Yeah. Well, I said, first of all, nothing is free in life. You will be my Shabbos goy, and in return, I will teach you. Now, I had no idea what Shabbos goy or Shabbos shmoy meant, but it sounded like a good idea to get into a Jewish community. And he told me, come on Friday at 6 o'clock, and I will explain you what to do. I was there at 6, he came at 7:30. He looked at me, was master. He said, you came at 6 o'clock, you told me. I said, no, 6 o'clock, 7 o'clock, 8 o'clock, this is Jewish time. You need to get used to it. And then he showed me what to do for Shabbos, for preparation of Shabbos. And he told me something very importantly. So my members, our members will not like you. They will not like to have somebody intruding in their small world that they created, that they carved out of in their life here in Germany. And they are the kackers. They will probably not like you at all. And that was what he said. And indeed, when I came on this first Friday night, they were hickering and pickering, and Itzhak said, look, just stay in the corner, listen, and don't move. And so I came every Friday, every Saturday, week by week, month by month, year by year. And the closer I came to this community of choice, the more I distanced myself from a community of origin. I absorbed the liturgy, the mannerism, the language. And it came to a breakup in my family. The major breakup came when I didn't show up for one Christmas, which fell on a Friday night. And Christmas Eve in an Orthodox Catholic family was a huge deal. And I remember it played like a movie in my head. I had to go with my mother to church, Holy Mass, coming back, eating symbolic food, carp and lentil soup. My father was decorating the Christmas tree at that time. He was ringing a bell. My mother opened the door to the living room. My father standing next to this huge Christmas tree with real candles, dressed in his finest dark suit, in his starched white shirt and the knight's cross around his neck, singing festive Christmas hymns. And I was not there. When I came back the next morning, all hell broke loose. And my father yelled and screamed and said, why didn't you show up here for a Christmas celebration? Do you know how your mother will suffer? I said, look, let's stop this Greek tragedy. You're sitting here with this knight's cross around your neck that you're proud of, that you're a hero. You're a murderer. This is blood stained. This is the blood of other people. You killed other people. I'm refusing to sit with a killer and a murderer on the same table, celebrating the birth of Christ. He looked at me and said one word, raus, get out. And there was a little problem. Ein kesef, no money. I was in the second to last year of medical school. I had a scholarship though, but unfortunately not enough money. And I never took money from the Jewish community, even when offered, but Itzhak must have told others that something happened. Because one member of the community who never talked to me, his name was Aaron, Zichrono Lebracha. Aaron approached me and said, du bist der Goy. So that's very, very right, yeah, after 5 years. Your name is Bernd. I said, yes, my name is Bernd. Hör mal zu, listen, deine Jacke ist schmutzig, deine Schuhe sind schmutzig, kauf dir neue Sachen. Your jacket is dirty, your shoes are dirty, buy new stuff, which was of course not true. And here's 100 mark, which was a huge amount of money at that time. I was stunned, insulted, and then being given money by Aaron. I went to Itzhak in his office, and I told Itzhak the story, and Itzhak looked at me and said, what? Aaron gave you 100 mark? He never gives any money. So at least that you took the opportunity and took from him 200. No, I didn't. Well, because you're a goy. He said, I don't understand. Itzhak had a sick humor, but still warm humor. He was my quasi-father, and he said, sit down. You don't understand us yet. None of us has regained their emotional jacket, as he called it, the emotions rebuilt. Aaron doesn't talk about his life. We only know from the Red Cross that he was in Auschwitz. He had nobody survive. And Aaron and I became best friends ever since. He told me his story, probably the first time ever that he told his story in the short time of his life left. He told me the story that he was a member of a Sonderkommando. These were the Jews who herded other Jews in the gas chamber, calming them down and telling them, it's okay, here's the number for the clothing, pick it up on the other side. And when the doors were closed, Cyclone B was dropped into the gas chamber. When everyone screaming and yelling stopped, the chamber doors were opened. They kept in, the Sonderkommando went in with gas masks, dragged out the bodies, burned them, crushed the bones, and scattered the ashes and the remains in the pits right next to the gas chamber. And Aaron described it to me in details. And Aaron died. And on this day of his death, I was called to come to Bamberg. It was just almost in the end of my studies. I went back to Bamberg, and Itzhak told me when we were sitting, all the members of the community in the office, somebody has to help us to create a Chefa Kaddish, and it will be you. You're strong, you understand medicine, we have to wash the body. I said, Itzhak, I'm not a Jew, you're one of us. And then at the graveside after his burial the next morning, Aaron gave me the prayer book and said, say Kaddish. And I said the Kaddish for my friend Aaron. And then when I crossed the line, I knew I crossed the line. I want to become a Jew. And I told Itzhak, I want to become a Jew. Itzhak looked at me and said, you forgot already about the number here on the arm? You only get suffering, pain, and that's all what you get. But I prepared for this moment, and I will send you to a rabbi in Frankfurt who will get these crazy ideas out of your head. He said, washes your head from these crazy ideas. And I met the rabbi, and the rabbi told me, I will teach you in respect for my friend Itzhak, but I will never convert you. I don't convert Germans. I will not even recommend you for conversion. And so I met him for the next couple of years, for the next 2 years, once a month. And whenever I met him and our shiur was over, he told me, I asked him about Giyur, conversion, and he brushed it aside until he got it, until he had enough in March of 1986, when he told me, look, I sent your case to the rabbinical court. I have nothing to do with that. And you will have the next meeting in November or December 1986. But until you get to the rabbinical court, there are some minor things that you have to take care of, such as a plastic surgery. I want to talk about it. It had to be done in a kosher hospital, in a Hasidic hospital in Switzerland. A few months later, I had to travel to Metz, France, to immerse myself in an Orthodox mikveh, in an Orthodox community in Metz. And in December 1986, I presented my case I was presented to the rabbinical court. And I remember it was like a court hearing. The rabbis were dressed in long black robes, had a hat on, like judges. And the chief rabbi asked me the question, look, I have here all your character witnesses. I know what you know. I know what person you are, but I don't care about that. I want to know why on earth a German whose father is a Nazi, whose father killed Jews, wants to become a Jew. If it's guilt, doesn't count. You need to convince me. And I convinced him. And I remember the moment when they came back in from a session, from the Dune, they called it. And I had to stand up, and they read its Teudat Giyur and the conversion certificate in German and then in Hebrew, or in Hebrew and then in German. The rabbi looked at me sternly, the chief rabbi, and asked me, do you understand? Yes. What is your name? Oh, my name is Bernd Wollschlaeger. No, what is your Hebrew name? I didn't think about it. Yeah, Ben Abraham, that's the name that you've been given as a convert. But what's your first name? He said, my name is Bernd. I said, do you know what it means? It's the bear slayer. So your name is Duvi Dov. Take it, it's for free. You're Dov Ben Abraham from now on. And I was overwhelmed, and he asked me, what do you want to do with that? And I said, I want to go to Israel. He said, why do you want to do that? I said, I have nothing to offer, no money. I cannot pay back anything, but I can give my life to fight in the army. And that's what I did. I emigrated to Israel 1 month later as Oleh Chadash, with the papers prepared by the Israeli embassy and the Sochnut, the Jewish agency. The day before I left, I wanted to say goodbye to my parents, even though I didn't want it. Itzhak made me do it. And my mother was crying. My father slammed the door, screaming and yelling that I should get the hell out of here, that I'm a traitor. And so I traveled to Israel. I settled in Israel, 6 months in a kibbutz, learning Hebrew, working during the day. Assigned to an Israeli hospital 6 months later to get my Israeli license, my German license, up to Israeli par. 1 month after I finished my stage, my internship, I was drafted into the military. I immediately revoked all my German citizenship, and I took voluntarily Israeli citizenship immediately in order to join the army. And got basic training, officers training, and then assigned in the combat zone in the West Bank, which at that time was experienced the first Intifada in 1988, right next to Ramallah. And it was a combat environment. So my troops, I was responsible for the health of several hundred soldiers. My commanding officers introduced me and said, Chevre, this is doctor, you have to change your name. Whatever, W, Dov. He is your doctor. That's it. All in battle gear, you have to listen to my command. If something happens to you, the doctor will take care of you. So here I was standing as a lieutenant in the uniform of a lieutenant, and I asked myself, if they find out that my father was a National Socialist, I'm actually a Nazi in drag, they will kick me out of here. I cannot talk about my life. I had this fear, panic to talk about my life. So I threw my life literally in the virtual closet, slammed the door, turned the key in the lock, and tried to throw the key away, which was a big mistake. And years later, my son asked me the question, Daddy, who is my grandfather? Abba mir Saba Shule. And I told him the story that I told you. And he said, "It's a cool story, Dad. Let me tell my friends." Well, obviously, I said, that's a bad idea. He went to a Jewish school at that time, in the senior in the Jewish high school in Miami, Orthodox high school. And so they had a family history day 3 weeks later, which was my luck, literally. And I was told, I was obviously not there, that my son then asked what is his family history. So he raised his hand proudly and said, "My grandfather was a famous Nazi." Now that doesn't fly well in the Jewish school. I got called into an emergency meeting with the principal and the rabbi. And the principal was very upset. "Dr. Wollschlaeger, your son told us verdrehte Geschichte, that your father was a Nazi." And I responded, "It's true." And the rabbi turned to me and said, "Can you tell us the story?" I told him the story, and he said, "Look, did you ever talk about it before?" "No." "Come with me." And he asked me to tell the story to my son's class. And in that moment, it happened what happened. The night the weight was lifted off my shoulders, I turned from night to day. I just asked myself, why on earth did I never close this circle of life? I have to go back to Germany. I have to do it. And I went back to Germany the following month in December 2004 with my son. And we visited my parents. The only place I could visit them was a cemetery. They were long gone. And ironically, the cemetery in Bamberg is a joint cemetery, a Jewish and a Christian section, which was not unusual for Bavarian towns where Jews and non-Jews lived so closely together. And my parents' graveside is one row parallel to the wall that separates from the Jewish from the Christian cemetery. If you ever go to Bamberg, go to the Jewish cemetery, look for the Wollschlaeger's grave. It's ironic. So when you see on the other side the gravestones casting their Jewish gravestones casting their shadow to the other side. And here I was standing with my son at my parents' graveside, and I said, "Look, I don't know what to explain to you, but it is telling, it is ironic that your grandparents, my parents, are buried in the shadow of history. I had only one choice: step out of the shadow, turned around, looked at the past, and learned what I could learn, and move forward into the light. My parents never did that. So they still live or rest in the shadow of history. And what I learned is what I'm a part to you, my son, and what I part to others. And what I learned is that hatred is not this dark matter in the universe. Hatred is not this amorphous black dark matter that we just absorb. No, hatred is something we create every day. The words of hatred that are not being countered and not being fought back. And then they fall on fertile ground, the mind of others, they sprout into deeds. If these deeds left unchallenged, then habits will form. And these habits shape, if not responded to, shape characters. And if these characters then create norms, social norms that explain but never excuse that an entire people turned against the Jews because it was normal. That was the norm. These were not human beings anymore. They were de-individualized, depersonalized, and then demonized. And the words of hatred lead to acts of hatred. Often, this is being the full responsibility of those who perpetuate that. So all Germans knew what happened. Everybody knew what happened, but everybody denied it. It was undeniable a lie. Just people like me and in my generation raised the flag and said, we don't want to do that ever again. We are responsible as Germans for the worst homicide, genocide in human history. We have to fight back against hatred. And that's what I do every day. Now, at the age of 62, unfortunately, I wish I would have been successful. At least can raise my voice. I mean, I'm not a megalomaniac that I said I will convince all mankind, but I can change one person at a time. But unfortunately, we have a relapse in the world, so to say. As a physician, I can say that, a relapse of hatred, because it's so much easier to hate than listening to others. I always tell my students, take the cotton out of your mouth, take the cotton out of your ear, put it in the mouth and listen. Listen to others, don't interrupt them. We need to communicate. We need to learn from each other. We need to be patient, because words of hatred, I experience and I know what happens when words turn into hatred. So having said that, I teach my children, I teach others. I'm always talking to many people as I can, like today in the morning. And hopefully I placed a seedling in your mind that grows into something different, into hope. Hope that against all odds change is possible. Thank you.
Well, if we were all sitting in a hall together now, I can assure there would be an incredible round of applause, because there was just, it's really almost, it left me speechless, to be honest. thank you for sharing that intimate story, and just sort of so vivid to almost, I felt like I was living that story alongside with you. So thank you for that, and thank you for being a
Thank
beacon
you,
of
Rabbi.
hope, a beacon of courage, a beacon of change, a beacon of standing up to injustices. It's incredible, and I can really see the comments that are coming through. But as we said, Dr. Bernd said he's prepared to answer some questions. So a number have come to me privately. So the first one was just more of a practical one, or sort of some details. Did you land up marrying that girl that you went to see in Haifa, or?
No, it was a puppy love, I call it. We liked each other a lot, but she went to the army. I went back to Germany, so naturally diverged. But 20 years later, it was 20, almost 20 years later, I gave a presentation on Galei Tzahal, the army radio, on Yom HaShoah, on the day preceding Yom HaShoah. And she heard my voice speaking in Hebrew, and she asked the station to give me my phone number. They called me. And then I called her and said, "Is it you, Dov?" I said, "Yes, it's me." "But you spoke German, you didn't speak Hebrew." So we came together a few weeks later, and she was a wonderful family, and we had a good time together. No, I didn't marry her.
Very good. A lot of people asking, what made you move on to the United States? Was that for work, or?
It was a story which was partially reason was personal motivation, family issues, and then work. 1991, in January 1991, as you know, Saddam Hussein attacked, or in August 1990, Saddam Hussein attacked Kuwait. I was immediately mobilized just 3 months after my military service to belong to a special unit, biological chemical weapon warfare. And we were dispatched in downtown Tel Aviv for possible chemical warfare. Now, on the night of the first missile attack, I was outside, my wife was at home here with our child, and we were outside in moon suits trying to determine if there are any chemical residues. And it was too much for her, and she said, "I cannot stand it anymore." And she wanted to go back to Miami where her family lived. And I was offered a fellowship in residency in family medicine. And after 3 years, I wanted to go back, but unfortunately we separated. My children, of course, right now 2, would have been alone with their father, me going back to Israel. So I decided instead coming 2 or 3 times a year to Israel and making my home, partial home there, my home in Miami.
Wonderful. People are asking me to ask you what's your feeling today towards Germany, in terms of how do you see what's happening, and also obviously there's still this rise of sort of anti-Semitism across the world, and how do you feel about it?
Mm-hmm. Well, Germany is a very different country. It underwent, of course, an evolution, not a revolution of thought, an evolution of thought, and to deal with the past was initial taboo, because Germans were distracted from rebuilding their lives. But in 1956, the then German president Theodor Heuss gathered all the surviving family members of the brave men and women of July the 20th, 1944, and he gave a speech, a moving speech, and said, "You're all heroes, you're not traitors," because they were called traitors in Germany still. And then, of course, the first Auschwitz trials in 1961 and 1962 in Frankfurt opened the mind to a generation like mine. And then, of course, came the teachings in the wake of the social democratic evolution. And we learned extensively about the Holocaust on generations now. So it's now genocide prevention education, not Holocaust education. Is it successful? Yes, it is. Germans are the least anti-Semitic people that you find. Is anti-Semitism in Germany, is it growing? Unfortunately, yes, worldwide. And the country, the epicenter is the United States of America, where we have wannabe neo-Nazis even sitting in the fringes of a major political party and running for office. And it's a very, very dangerous time, and specifically here in the United States.
Bernd, people ask, well, I can answer this, but people wanted to know what's your book called, and you can find Bernd's book on Amazon. I think it's there and probably other places, but it's called The German Life, and of course by Dr. Bernd Wollschlaeger. So please, if you're interested.
I'm not in a book tour, so I'm a bad representative for my.
That's right. This was not a book tour, but if anyone found that story interesting, I'm sure you can find more details.
Kindle is available. It's easier.
It's also in Kindle, yeah. What's your feeling? I mean, in terms of your father, like, obviously you described it quite well, and it was almost quite a a strong reaction that I felt. You know, we're obviously thinking about my own father and how that person can really be looked at and turn your eyes and your heart against him. How did that affect you as a person?
I had only one father. Everybody has only one father. And this father I'm supposed to love and to hate. I had long discussions with Itzhak about that, my quasi-father. And Itzhak understood my pain. He said, Bernd, you have to respect your father as a father, but whatever he did to others, it is not your fault. And a good rabbi told me, you have to let go, and you have to, only what you can do is to respect him as your biological father. But when I come to Bamberg, maybe once every other year, I go to the gravesite of my parents, and I can proudly say, I'm a different person. I'm a son of my father, National Socialist, but I'm a Jew, an Israeli, and a soldier, an officer. And that is for me most importantly. And what he did to others, I'm not the one to judge. That will be another judgment day.
Wow, that's very powerful. And I think that's incredible, you know, the ability for you to sort of look at truth and look at kindness and look at what's right and you know, against all odds in terms of, you know, going against what your father and what he sort of understood. Well, how do you understand what people at that time were thinking, you know, that your father still was so brainwashed to think these things?
My father, and that's not an excuse, born and raised in the end of the First World War. My grandfather was an officer in the First World War. My great-grandfather was an officer in the Franco-Prussian War of 1870, and my father was a generation of warriors. He was sent to the NAPOLA, National Political Education Institute, which is the West Point, which was the West Point of the National Socialist Party. And he was literally raised in the image of a National Socialist, and he believed in it. He swore it to hook, bait, and sinker. And he was totally convinced that National Socialism is the solution for the world. But I remember it was a little bit more complex when he sent me, when I was in Israel, I got a letter from him. First of all, the letter was very bitter that I left him. And on the one hand, on the other hand, I'm also a traitor. But he described himself as a national German hero, but betrayed by his Führer, who committed suicide, and betrayed by those who just escaped. He stayed in Germany to reignite the ideas of National Socialism, but had to understand this was a lie and a lying ideology. And so he was caught between the rock and a hard place. And actually, when he died on June the 1st, 1987, I received a notification about a week later, and his funeral in the wake, pictures about it too for my older sister. And it clearly stated in his will, I'm a traitor. I'm not part of the family. Mein Sohn, den man nennt Bernd, the son that they call Bernd, is not my son anymore. I was forbidden to participate in his funeral if I would have been there, and I was forbidden to approach his gravesite. I'm the traitor. I'm a pariah. I'm affected by a disease. Well, obviously I'm not, and I have a healthy ego, and I go to my father's gravesite and my mother's gravesite every other year just to show respect.
Wow. Do you feel, did your father know that you converted to Judaism, or?
Yes, he actually found out when, how did he find out? Yeah, it was a very, very odd way to find out. He got a call from one of his buddies that were still alive and celebrating the good old time, and said, your son Bernd refuses to serve in the military. He filed a conscious objector status. And he also argued in this letter that, of course, was supposed to be private, that he converting to Judaism to atone for the sins of his father. So he yelled and screamed at me. But to his benefit, and again, as a complex personality, he wrote a letter to the draft board and saying that, arguing that I'm an idealist. He doesn't agree what I'm doing, but he supports my decision not to serve in the military because war is not the solution.
Wow. You mentioned you had a sister, is that right? Did I hear correctly?
Two sisters, yeah.
And how did their journey land up going?
Well, my older sister, Krista, was 10 years older than I am. She unfortunately died in 2006, and I visited her several times as a first gateway towards my family and helped her out. And she told me many more details about my father's life and what he did. And my younger sister, she's 3 years younger than I am. She lives in Bamberg in the same hometown. And I visit her every other year, or at least once a year I try. And she has children. They refer to me as cool uncle from Miami because, and they came to visit me actually twice. So yes, I have a remaining family member, and we have a fairly good relationship. She's worried about me because with coronavirus and treating in the hospital, she's worried that I'm going affected and die, but I'm still here.
And please God for many years to come. So you've obviously, I mean, here you are talking to us. You've obviously given a number of talks. Do you ever find any sort of negative reactions to your, maybe from either from Jews or possibly non-Jews that hear this talk, or is it generally felt a positive experience?
First of all, I had the privilege, and I have the privilege to speak to communities throughout the world, and like speaking to you, it allows me to learn and understand how other Jews live and how other Jews practice and how other Jews deal with it in a non-Jewish environment. And wherever I travel to throughout the world, I learned one thing. Many people are receptive to a message of positive thinking, a message of love and reconciliation, of understanding, not kumbaya, but of honesty. And I maybe once I encountered somebody once or twice. I think it was a he who told me that. How can a German become a Jew? That's an outrageous thing, and I respect that. I respect that because he's entitled to think it the way he thinks. But 99.9% is a positive response. And I engage my audience also in rethinking their lives and revisiting what they can do to decrease hatred and to be at the side of those who were oppressed.
Yeah. And certainly, I mean, from what I was hearing, in your talk, obviously there's a lot of powerful aspects of your talk, but, certainly how dangerous, that propaganda and that type of thinking can lead to really someone truly believing that to kill another person is the right thing. It's quite scary how strong that can be.
You're very correct, Rabbi, and this is the three-step approach that I always tell. You de-individualize people. This is not the Moshe, Rivka, but there's Abraham and Sarah. That's the names you can take. Then you depersonalize them. They're not human beings. They're monsters. They kill people. They drain blood for preparations of the matzah, make matzah out of blood. And then comes the demonization. They're the enemies of the people. And that is okay to go after them because you don't go after a human being. You go after a demon. That's happened in the United States. Unfortunately, we reached a situation in the United States, and it's not political, it's just societal, that hatred rules. People sit in the echo chamber, reading only what they want to read, what reassures and reconfirms their opinion. Don't want to be challenged by other opinions. Don't communicate, don't dialogue. I get that every day in my office.
Yeah.
Or not every day, but a few times a week when somebody told me, actually just a few days ago, I said, well, as a Jew, you must hate Arabs, right? I said, why do you say that? Yeah, because Arabs are enemies. I said, look, you're messing with the wrong guy because I'm an Israeli. And we have Israeli Arabs, 20% of our population, who serve not only us in good times, but in bad times. And hatred is the last thing what we need in this fractured world. We need to start to talk to each other. Take the cotton out of your ears and put it in the mouth and listen.
Absolutely. Powerful words. And I think that we can all change. And that's also, as the Jewish, us as Jews, we understand that Shuvah, that making amends, and of course, not even, you didn't even do anything wrong, but being able to change course to do the right thing,
Tikkun Olam is a step at a time.
Yeah.
And Tikkun Olam doesn't only affect us as Jews, what we need to do, but Tikkun Olam affects broader aspects of even how we can guide others to rebuild the world.
Fantastic. We'll take one or two more questions that have been asked, if you're okay with that, and then
sure, I'm up.
I just want to remind everyone that Dr. Wollschlaeger, he got up at 6 a.m. To give us this talk. Although he said
5:30.
Oh, he got up at 5:30 exactly. 6 a.m. he started the talk. And he's a very, very busy doctor, and lots going on, of course, with coronavirus and tough times over there. So again, sincere appreciation from all of us here who've heard this phenomenal talk. And if anybody, again, I'm not pitching his book. He didn't ask me to mention his book even, but I think a lot of people are finding the story very inspiring. So if you want to, I guess, get some more details, you can read that book, and it's on Amazon or Kindle. But in terms of, there's a couple of questions here. Do you feel that Germany will ever be a place for Jews again?
Well, actually, you're in the past. It is a place for Jews again. We have 50,000 Israelis living in Germany with a German passport. The German government very liberally distributes German passport, awards German passport to all descendants of Germans who had to flee Germany.
Right.
So we had a huge community in Berlin, and actually Germany is being considered to be one of those havens of anti-Semitism. This island is that anti-Semitism is being obviously exists too, but is condoned not condoned by the German government. It is fought against by every level of government. If you're left, right, in the middle, anti-Semitism is not cool anymore in Germany, and therefore Germany, I can tell you, it's a safer place to live as a Jew beside of Israel.
Yeah, that's fascinating, isn't it? This is obviously, I mean, you've told us a lot of personal things, but just somebody was curious to know sort of what type of community do you affiliate with in Florida? Obviously, there's a big Jewish community there. Are you practicing more?
Well, I'm practicing in North Miami Beach, close to Aventura, and it's 90% Jewish. There's only one church and dozens of synagogues. So it's a world by itself. A lot of Israelis, Mexican, Latin Jews. So it's a very mix. In my practice, it's like the Tower of Babel every day, and I have to switch between 4 languages. Drives my students crazy. The problem what was the second part of your question?
Do you, what's your, like, do you, are
my
you
belonging to a community? Well, I tell you something that you probably don't want to hear, but I say it anyway. When Jews were standing on the ramp in Auschwitz, being selected to die or to live a little bit longer, nobody asked them, are you Reform, conservative, or Orthodox?
That's right.
They ask him if they're Jews. And why do you divide ourselves? I mean, I'm an equal opportunity accuser from both sides. I'm socialized into Orthodox Jewish life. My favorite synagogue is Sephardic Orthodox, because with the Israelis, we speak Hebrew, and we kind of a little bit raucous. We talk in the service, the normal stuff like in Israel. So I'm Orthodox Sephardic socialized, so to say. But when somebody asks me, are you Orthodox, are you Reform, or are you reconstructive, or whatever idea, I said, look, let's stop this dividing ourselves. We need to unite ourselves. And I be very close to Chabad communities, because in Chabad you can be the way you are, and being in this large tent with one goal only, that we all practice our religion in freedom and enjoy.
Yeah, beautiful. Well said. Well said. And I think just one final point, obviously we spoke about, speaking out, and I'm glad you said that about the Arabs, because, there's never a right to hate anyone, and of course if people do the wrong thing, it should be called out, but we have to be ambassadors of connecting people, ambassadors of achdus, of unity amongst people, not only amongst the Jewish community. So thank you for saying that point as well, because it's, obviously you turned away from hatred. You don't want to go and find it again in the place that you found was a place of peace.
I can tell you one thing that I personally experienced. In the night of the 17th of January 1991, when Saddam Hussein attacked Israel, Tel Aviv, I think about more than a dozen Scud missiles were launched against Israel. And I was outside in an ambulance, the Nayedet Tipul Nimratz, a mobile intensive care unit. With me was a Christian Arab paramedic, sitting next to an Orthodox Jew with payas and a kippah. Then there was a Jews in our ambulance too. And we had, nobody asked ourselves, what are you, Jewish, you're Christian, or Muslim? We fighting a common enemy. They were as scared as I was. And in the emergency room in Rambam Hospital in Haifa, the entire service during the 2006 Lebanon war was run by Israeli Arabs. The head of the emergency room is Israeli Arabs. Do we care that he's an Arab? No. They replaced those physicians who had to go overdraft and fight in the Lebanon in 2006, and they ran the show and provided the services. There was no animosity. There was service to the community. They're part of the parcel of Israeli society. So, but people often forget, we are the only country in the world where Jews and Arabs try to live together for 70 years. The only country in the world. Does it work out all the time? Hell no. But it works because we are trying. Yeah. And it's something that one need to take in consideration.
Unbelievable. So once again, a big thank you to you for your time and for your, sharing your intimate story and obviously doing so that you can help change our lives, because each of us can make a difference, even if we're in a very close-knit community, perhaps, and not necessarily exposed to, the challenge that you were exposed to. But nonetheless, everybody does face this on a day-to-day basis. I mean, I know in a very small sense, with people sort of criticizing and hating each other because they're not, this person's wearing a mask. This, obviously people do the wrong thing. But we've got to try and unite more than divide. I think that's
absolutely.
And look, we wish you well. We wish your family well, and God willing, the crisis of Corona ends by you and by us. And everybody who's watching, thank you for joining us. As I mentioned, there's lots of events going on. Unfortunately, we don't have much more time. So if you do want to read further, I see some people have posted links to the Amazon where you can buy the book.
I should hire you as my PR manager.
I forgot to tell you, I'm getting 10% of all sales. Yeah, but it's been a real blessing to hear you, and thank you for that. And God bless you.
Thanks, Rabbi.
God bless everybody who's watched, and stay safe, stay healthy, and join us again for another event. Thank you.
Laila Tov.
Laila Tov, Hitraot. We'll just leave it open for a minute for people to take a chance here. Give a virtual applause, a silent applause. Thanks, everybody. Thank you for your support, and thank you for watching tonight. We're going to end the meeting. So everybody have a good night. And as Dr. Bernd said, Lahitra, until next time.